Before we begin tonight's journey through the past, allow yourself to settle. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath slow. Let the day fall quietly away behind you. Tonight, we travel to the American frontier, to a time of dust-covered wagons, wide-open skies, and whispered dreams of a better life. We are setting off along the Oregon Trail, one of the most famous routes of migration in history. A road not paved in stone, but worn into the earth by thousands of tired feet, rolling wheels, and steady hooves. Stretching over 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri, to the lush valleys of Oregon, the trail carried with it the hopes, fears, and resolve of tens of thousands of pioneers in the 1800s. But why did they go? To understand that, we must begin at the source, in the crowded farmlands and weary towns of the eastern United States. The year is 1843. The country is young. The population is growing fast. Land in the east is scarce, expensive, and overworked. The soil in many places has been drained of life. For poor families and farmers, the promise of a fresh start, of land and freedom, begins to glow like a lantern in the distance. Word spreads of Oregon, of fertile farmland, mild weather, and open space. Newspapers call it a land of milk and honey. Government officials and settlers who had made the journey west speak of rivers thick with fish, forests with trees towering like cathedrals, and valleys rich with black soil. The federal government encourages expansion. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were meant to expand across the continent, fills the speeches of politicians and the prayers of settlers. A promise is made: if you can reach Oregon and settle there, the land can be yours. Hundreds of acres, for free. A new beginning for those willing to risk the road. But this road is not easy. It crosses rivers wide and wild, prairies that stretch for weeks, deserts where the heat cracks the earth, and mountains that rise like teeth from the land. The journey takes months, from spring until the first snows. Wagons break. Illness spreads. Danger waits in many forms, from accidents to weather to misunderstandings between cultures. And still, people go. Wagon by wagon, family by family, they go. And tonight, you'll go with them. Not in haste, and not with fear, but gently, with the slow rhythm of history unfolding like a lullaby. So close your eyes now, and picture a dirt road leading west, kissed by morning light. Let us begin. The sky above Independence, Missouri, is pale with morning light, a soft gray-blue that glows faintly through thin clouds. Dew coats the blades of spring grass, and the scent of damp earth rises in the still air. It is April 1843, and the town is already stirring. Chickens cluck softly in their coops. A cow moos in the distance. Somewhere, a blacksmith hammers iron, the ringing echo softened by distance. From the wooden homes clustered near the town square, the smell of smoke from morning fires drifts slowly through the streets. Hickory, pine, and the faint spice of fried cornmeal. Down a narrow lane, in a modest one-room house, a man sits at a handmade table with a crumpled map in his hands. He is a farmer, like many others, born in Ohio but drawn westward by stories he's heard whispered in church pews, general stores, and over the crackle of campfires. The map before him is yellowed, its edges curled, the route drawn in thick, hand-inked lines. The Oregon Trail. A winding path through plains, deserts, rivers, and mountains, stretching far beyond the edge of everything he's ever known. Behind him, his wife tends to the hearth, stirring a bubbling pot of oats with dried apples. The smell is warm and sweet. Their youngest daughter is still asleep beneath a patchwork quilt in the corner, her small hand tucked beneath her cheek. The man's name is Elijah. His wife is Mary. They are in their early 30s, with calloused hands and steady eyes. Years of work have carved quiet strength into them. They have 4 children, 2 oxen, a wagon still being built behind the barn, and a choice to make. They have heard the stories. The Willamette Valley, in Oregon, has the finest farmland in the country, they say. A man who makes it there will be given land for free, up to 640 acres. Enough to raise crops, cattle, and children. Elijah's brother went last year and sent a letter back, full of wonder at the vast green fields and the gentle rain. He wrote of how the soil crumbles in your hand like cake. He wrote of rivers filled with trout and wild berries growing along the banks. But he also wrote of the dangers. Cholera, a sickness that steals the breath within hours. River crossings where entire wagons have vanished. The slow ache of thirst on the salt flats. The wind in the Rockies, so cold it burns the skin. Graves by the trail, marked only with stones and scraps of wood. Still, Elijah cannot stop thinking about it. They have little here. The harvest last year was thin. The soil grows weaker each spring. And land, good land, is too expensive to dream of buying. They have no bank savings. No powerful friends. But they do have a wagon. And the courage to begin. That afternoon, Elijah walks with Mary beneath the oak trees lining their small pasture. Their boots press softly into the damp earth. The smell of grass, dew, and cattle hangs in the air. A robin flutters past, carrying twigs for its nest. They speak little, but they say enough. The looks they share carry the weight of hope and worry and silent agreement. That night, after the children have gone to sleep, Elijah takes out a small wooden box and counts what they have: coins, supplies, tools. It will be tight, but it's possible. And so, they decide. They will go west. In the weeks that follow, the household changes. The wagon is loaded piece by piece. Each item carefully chosen. Flour, bacon, beans, a small barrel of salt pork, a Dutch oven, rope, rifles, powder and shot, wool blankets, quilts, a spare axle, a family Bible. There is no room for furniture, no room for porcelain dishes or sentimental keepsakes. Every pound matters. Mary wraps her mother's photograph in cloth and tucks it into the flour barrel, hidden but not forgotten. The children watch with wide eyes as the oxen are fitted with yokes. They practice walking beside the wagon. They are told what to expect, gently, and only in part. Some families form wagon groups. Wagon trains, they are called, traveling together for safety, support, and shared burdens. Elijah joins one led by a man named Jacob Taylor, a former trapper who's been to Oregon once before. He will guide them, at least through the first stretch. The final night before they leave, the family gathers one last time in their small home. Outside, the frogs croak softly in the grass. Crickets sing in the tall weeds by the fence. The air smells of smoke, damp soil, and lilacs in bloom. They sit around the hearth in silence. Mary holds the youngest child in her lap, rocking slowly. Elijah rubs his hands, worn and rough, together, then places them over his wife's. They are afraid, but they are also ready. The next morning, as the sun rises golden behind the trees, the wagon rolls onto the road west. The creak of wood, the low bellow of oxen, the soft crunch of wheels over dirt. A long journey has begun, and the Oregon Trail lies waiting. The road west was not paved with gold, nor lined with welcome signs. It was dirt and dust. It was wind and silence. It was motion, slow, steady motion, of wagons pulled by oxen, day after day, mile after mile. For Elijah and Mary, and the children nestled between sacks of flour and crates of dried goods, the journey had truly begun. The morning sun glowed a gentle gold as it rose over the low hills of Missouri, warming the wagon covers and casting long, soft shadows across the land. Dew clung to blades of grass along the roadside, glistening briefly before fading into the air. The road ahead stretched on like a ribbon of earth, disappearing into a line of trees far off in the distance. They had joined a wagon train of 11 families, some with young children, others with grey-haired elders who had seen the revolution end and watched new states rise. There were oxen and mules, barking dogs, and one boy with a fiddle who played quietly in the evenings. The sounds of departure were gentle but constant. The low groan of wagon wheels turning on wooden axles. The slap of leather reins. The grunts of animals urged forward by quiet voices. Metal pots clinking softly in crates. A cough here, a child's laugh there, a murmured prayer from a mother walking beside her children in silence. Mary held her youngest on her hip as they walked. The baby's tiny hand curled into her shawl. Elijah took the lead beside the oxen, his boots brushing through wild grasses that grew waist-high on either side of the path. The pace was slow, just 2 miles an hour, sometimes less. They stopped often, to rest the animals, to adjust the load, to drink from the creeks that crossed the trail. And yet, they moved. That first night, they camped in a clearing not far from the river. The grass there had been trampled by years of travelers before them, deep wagon ruts still visible in the fading light. The air was still, and the only sound was the soft huff of oxen catching their breath. The sky above stretched endlessly, pale blue fading into lavender, then grey, and finally into a soft darkness filled with stars. The smell of campfires rose into the sky, burning cottonwood and pine, a hint of bacon, and the warm comfort of boiling coffee. Mary unrolled a wool blanket near the wagon, smoothing it carefully over the soft dirt. The children huddled close. They were tired, but their eyes were wide, full of wonder and newness. Every sound, every shadow, every rustling bush seemed unfamiliar, like the first time sleeping in a new house. Elijah sat nearby, oiling the rifle slowly, not out of fear, but out of habit. Better to be prepared. Around them, the other families moved quietly, setting up their own camps. A few shared boiled beans and jerky. One man offered firewood. Another, a laugh and a story from back home. There was no music that first night. Just the crackle of fire, the soft hum of wind through trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and somewhere far off, a coyote's lonely cry. They slept in fits and starts, wrapped in blankets beneath the wagon, the hard earth pressing against their backs like a reminder they were not in Missouri anymore. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the trail began to settle into their bones. Wake before the sun. Feed the children. Water the oxen. Check the wagon. Walk. And walk. And walk some more. They learned to listen to the sounds of the land, the chirp of prairie larks at dawn, the whistle of wind through dry grass, the splash of hooves in shallow creeks. The smell of the world changed too. Earthy and clean in the morning, hot and dry by afternoon. The scent of leather warmed by sunlight, of sweat soaking into cotton, of firewood on their hands at night. The land itself began to flatten. Hills gave way to open prairie, a sea of golden grass stretching in every direction. The road felt endless, but it was steady, and with each step, Oregon grew a little closer, even if it didn't feel that way just yet. They passed broken wheels half buried in the ground, a rusted cooking pan hanging from a tree, scorched grass from an old fire ring, signs of those who had come before, and reminders that not everyone had made it all the way. One evening, Elijah paused as they crossed a gentle rise in the land. Ahead, the trail seemed to glow in the amber light of sunset. A dust cloud hung low, kicked up by the wagons. The sky burned with orange and rose, then melted into the darkening blue of night. He looked back and saw the long line of wagons winding behind him, their canvas tops glowing like soft lanterns in the fading light. Mary stood beside him, the baby asleep on her shoulder. She was quiet, her eyes wide as they scanned the endless land ahead. "I didn't think it would be so open," she whispered. "It makes you feel small, Elijah said. "It makes me feel free." And they stood together, breathing in the wind, warm, dry, and filled with dust, as night crept in around them. Not every moment was peaceful. They quickly learned that even simple things could become dangerous. One morning, a young boy wandered from camp to chase a butterfly. His mother screamed when she realized he was missing. It took an hour to find him, crouched by the river, shoes soaked, staring at frogs. The boy laughed. The mother cried. The lesson was learned. Another day, the lead wagon tipped as it crossed a narrow slope. The axle cracked. A barrel rolled free and burst open, dried apples and oats scattering into the grass. No one was hurt, but it was a reminder: the trail did not forgive carelessness. Mary's hands became blistered from holding the baby and walking in the sun. Elijah's boots wore thin. The children's faces grew ruddy from windburn. And yet, they smiled often, because every mile was a new mile, one they had never seen before. At night, the families gathered in small circles, sharing food, stories, and news from those ahead. Some spoke of Fort Kearney, still a week away, a place to rest, to buy fresh supplies, to send letters back home, if there was time. Others shared cautionary tales, of rivers that ran fast even in summer, of storms that rolled in without warning, and of a sickness that had taken 2 children in another wagon train last season. The children didn't always understand the weight of these words, but the adults did, and they moved forward with care. One quiet evening, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered like pinholes in a velvet curtain, Mary sang softly, a lullaby, half remembered from her own childhood. The baby stirred. The wind hushed. Even the oxen seemed still. Elijah listened, one hand resting on his knee, the other cradling a tin mug of coffee gone cold. He looked at the faces of his children, their cheeks smudged with trail dust, eyes drooping with sleep, and felt something deep settle in his chest. It was not comfort. Not exactly. But it was hope. And in that hope, there was peace. Each day brought them closer. Each night brought stars. And the trail, unbroken and steady, stretched ever westward beneath their feet. The days on the trail began to blur together, not because they were dull, but because they moved to a rhythm older than clocks. A rhythm set by the sun, the animals, and the steady turn of wheels. Life on the Oregon Trail was not about rushing. It was about surviving the journey, one slow mile at a time. Each morning began in the pale gray light before sunrise. The air was cool, sometimes even cold, and the earth was still damp with night. Dew clung to blades of grass. The canvas wagon tops glistened faintly. If the night had been especially chilly, a thin mist hovered near the ground, softening the landscape into a ghostly hush. The first to rise were usually the teamsters, the men who handled the oxen or mules. You could hear them moving about camp, their boots crunching over the dirt, the soft murmurs of morning voices, the clink of iron pots as they stirred last night's embers back to life. Mary would rise with the children. Her fingers numb, she'd wrap her shawl around her shoulders and start the small fire, coaxing it to life with dry twigs and tinder. The scent of wood smoke mixed with the gentle steam of boiling coffee, and sometimes fried bacon or cornmeal cakes. It was a simple breakfast, just enough to fill the belly and warm the spirit. As the sun climbed, tents were rolled and blankets packed. The wagons were checked, wheels tightened, barrels secured. And then came the call. Wagons ho! A soft chorus of creaking wheels and groaning wood followed. The oxen stepped forward. Dust rose in lazy spirals beneath their hooves. The train was moving once again. Most families walked. The wagons were too full for passengers, and the jostling ride over rocky trails was hard on the body. Only the very young, the very old, or the sick rode inside. Mary walked with the baby in a sling across her chest, the older children trailing beside her, taking turns gathering wildflowers or picking up oddly shaped stones from the path. Elijah walked ahead with the oxen, calling to them in a low, even tone. "Get up, Buck. Gee, Duke. That's it." The oxen responded not to whips, but to voice and tone. They were steady creatures. Strong, quiet, and essential. Without them, there would be no journey. The sun rose higher. The heat deepened. By midday, shirts were damp with sweat. Faces red. Lips dry. Dust coated everything: eyebrows, boots, blankets, and even the food. The smell of sweat, leather, warm canvas, and scorched grass filled the air. Sometimes they passed other wagon trains, heading west, just like them. Greetings were exchanged. News shared. Water offered if it was safe. Other times, they passed landmarks that had become famous among travelers. Lone trees standing tall against the sky, boulders shaped by wind and time, or carved initials marking a brief human moment against the vastness of the land. Children learned to recognize these markers and would cheer when they saw them in the distance. "Look, Mama, the split rock. There it is, the old tree with the carving." These moments, though small, brought joy. Midday meant a short break, if possible. The wagons pulled into a circle or line, not for defense, but for shade and rest. The oxen were watered. The children ate dried fruit or a cold biscuit. Adults chewed slowly, speaking in low voices or not at all. Time was precious. The days were long, and the need to keep moving pressed gently but constantly against every choice. Afternoons brought fatigue. Feet ached. Shoulders sagged. Blisters stung. Dust clung to throats and lashes. But still, the train moved forward. By late afternoon, the search began for a good place to camp. The ideal spot had water, grass for the animals, and level ground for tents and fires. Some places had all three. Many did not. The wagons would circle in, again, not for battle, but to define the space. A kind of moving village, reshaped each night. The oxen were unyoked and led to graze. Fires were lit. Pots clanged. Voices filled the air again, softer now, worn from the day. Dinner was whatever could be cooked quickly. Beans, salt pork, maybe rice or dried fruit rehydrated in boiled water. Bread if someone had the energy to bake it in a Dutch oven. Otherwise, hardtack, the dry, almost flavorless cracker that could last for months. The children's laughter rose briefly, then faded as exhaustion claimed them. They fell asleep quickly, some beneath the wagon, others in simple tents, curled together for warmth and comfort. Mary and Elijah stayed up a little longer. They sat by the fire, sharing a tin cup of weak coffee. The sky above glittered with stars, unbroken by buildings or lanterns. The air cooled. Crickets chirped. A night bird called once, then again. "I never knew how many stars there were," Mary whispered. "They say you can see all the way to heaven out here," Elijah replied. Neither spoke after that. They just listened. To the fire. To the wind. To the quiet heartbeat of the earth beneath them. And so the days passed. Wash day came once a week. Clothes were scrubbed in creek water, slapped against rocks, then hung to dry on wagon spokes or tree branches. Shoes were mended in the evenings. Hair was brushed by firelight. Letters were written, though no one knew when they'd reach home. Elijah carved notches into the handle of his knife, one for each week past. Mary kept a diary, when she had time, in small, careful lines. April 29th, fair skies. Saw antelope. 2 wagons behind broke a wheel. Helped them mend it. Lucy has a cough. We sang after supper. These small notes carried the weight of memory. They became her anchor. One day, a boy in the wagon train lost his wooden whistle. It had been his favorite thing. A simple carved toy, given to him by his grandfather. He cried, a deep, quiet cry, sitting on a crate beside the wagon. When another child found it an hour later, caught in a tuft of grass along the trail, the joy in his face was brighter than sunrise. There were few toys on the trail, few luxuries, but moments like that, a found whistle, a clean spring, a rainbow after a storm, they stayed in people's hearts forever. As they moved westward, the trail grew rougher. Streams turned to rivers. Prairie grasses gave way to dry, cracked soil. The winds picked up. Some nights, there were storms, flashes of lightning in the distance, thunder that rolled for miles, and rain that fell so hard it sounded like nails on canvas. But the wagons held. The people endured. And each morning, the train moved forward once more. On the Oregon Trail, daily life was not grand. It was simple, ordinary, quiet, repetitive, and deeply human. It was full of sweat and patience, of singing in the wind, of boiling beans and chasing children, of mending what was broken and walking on, even when your feet begged to stop. And within that rhythm, that quiet, dusty rhythm, was something beautiful, something close to sacred. The slow unfolding of a journey not just across land, but through time, through challenge, through change, and toward something unknown, and yet deeply hoped for. The days on the trail had settled into routine. Slow mornings, long hours walking, and quiet evenings under a soft blanket of stars. But now, in the second month of travel, the trail began to change. It wasn't just the land, though the prairie grasses were thinning, giving way to rockier soil and wind-swept ridges. It wasn't only the weather, though the wind had picked up, sharper now, with a bite that whispered of the mountains ahead. It was the wear, the quiet unraveling, the weight of miles beginning to press on bodies, on wagons, on spirits. One morning, the oxen didn't rise. They were lying still in the early light, breath heavy, eyes dull. Elijah moved quickly, checking their hooves, then their bellies. One of them, the older, stronger one, had a limp. Nothing broken, just strain. Too many miles, too much pulling. They rested longer that day. Some grumbled, others nodded in silent agreement. The oxen were the heart of every wagon. Without them, there was no forward motion. Mary rubbed the animal's side, whispering softly, her voice calm and low. "Easy now. There you go. You're a good boy." The ox did not understand the words, but he heard her voice, and he closed his eyes for a while. Later that week, one of the wagons behind them broke an axle. The sound echoed across the open land, a sharp crack, then silence. People rushed to help, surrounding the tilted wagon like ants at work. Tools were pulled out, wood inspected. The axle had snapped near the wheel. Elijah lent a hand, wiping sweat from his brow as he braced the frame while others lifted. It took hours to fix. By the time they were moving again, the sun was low, and dust clung to their lips like flour. The children began to tire more easily. Their shoes wore thin. Their faces were smudged with dust, and their hands, once soft, were now scraped and calloused. Lucy, the youngest daughter, developed a deep cough. It rattled in her chest at night, pulling Mary from sleep again and again. They had no doctor, only dried herbs, a little honey, warm water, when they could heat it. Mary sang to her in the evenings, brushing the hair from Lucy's warm forehead. The melody was soft, slow, a lullaby passed down through generations. The other children watched in silence. They understood, in their own quiet way, that this was the beginning of something harder. Not just a trip, but a trial. The wind changed, too. No longer a soft breeze through grass, but stronger now. Dry, sharp gusts that lifted sand into the air and stung bare skin. It whistled through cracks in the wagons and rattled loose canvas ties. Cooking fires needed more stones now, more careful tending. The sky was bigger than ever, but sometimes it felt less like freedom and more like distance. Still, the wagon train pressed on, step by step, mile by mile, always westward. Then came the day when a young boy fell. It happened quickly, a stumble near the rear wagon, a cry, and the dull thud of a small body hitting the dirt. Elijah ran to him. So did others. The boy's name was Samuel, 10 years old, adventurous, quick-footed, and always helping his father with the mules. He'd tripped over a rock hidden in the grass. His ankle was twisted badly, maybe broken. He tried not to cry, but the pain bent his face in half. They made a splint from willow branches and cloth torn from an old shirt. His wagon would slow. He'd have to ride now, tucked inside with the crates and sacks. No more walking for him, not for weeks. The mood changed after that. There was no panic, but there was quiet. A new kind of awareness. That this trail was not only long, it could be cruel. Food supplies began to run low for some. The flour was stretched thinner. The salt pork, once eaten freely, was now measured carefully. They added wild greens when they found them, dandelion leaves, purslane, bits of mint growing near streams. Once, they found wild onions. Another time, mushrooms. Everyone celebrated. But they worried too. If food was already becoming tight now, what would it be like in the mountains? One day, a storm rolled in without warning. The morning had been warm and clear. By noon, dark clouds had gathered like heavy curtains in the sky. Thunder grumbled low in the distance, and the wind began to howl. They tried to set camp early, but the rain came fast, thick, cold, relentless. It turned the dirt into a river of mud. The wagons groaned. Children huddled beneath oilcloth. Firewood soaked through. The animals panicked and had to be calmed. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged flashes, illuminating faces drawn tight with fear. Elijah and Mary crouched beneath their wagon, the children pressed close. The baby whimpered. Lucy's cough returned. Mary pulled them closer beneath the blanket. And they waited. Waited for the storm to pass. Waited for the ground to dry. Waited for the sky to give them light again. When morning came, the air was fresh. The earth smelled clean. The puddles sparkled with early sun. Birds sang again, as if nothing had happened. The wagons rolled out slowly. The wheels left thick tracks in the softened ground. But something had changed. The people of the wagon train were quieter now. More alert. More tired. More grateful for small things. A dry blanket, a warm meal, a child's giggle. Even in hardship, there were moments of beauty. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they passed through a patch of land thick with wildflowers. Yellow, purple, white, petals bending in the wind, filling the air with their faint perfume. The children ran ahead, laughing, their hands brushing through the tall stems. Mary picked a few and placed them in the wagon, beside a photograph wrapped in cloth. A small softness, a touch of color in the dust. That night, the moon rose full and bright. It lit the plains in silver light, and even the tired oxen turned their heads to see it. They did not speak much of the hardships. There were no speeches, no complaints. Just the quiet endurance of people who knew that to stop was to fail, and that every mile, however difficult, brought them one step closer to Oregon. Closer to the land promised in whispers. Closer to the green valleys and clean rivers and fertile soil. Closer to something they had never seen, but could already imagine in their hearts. There were many dangers along the Oregon Trail, but few were as feared or as unforgettable as the rivers. They did not come every day. But when they appeared, winding wide and brown across the land, they brought with them a quiet tension that settled over the wagon train like morning fog. You could hear it in the stillness of the camp, in the careful way people moved, in the hushed voices, in the long silences. Because the rivers were not always shallow, and they did not always forgive. It was early morning when they reached the Big Blue River. The trail had followed its curve for some time, the sound of flowing water always just over the rise. Now it stretched before them, wide, swift, and cold, with grey ripples breaking over stones and driftwood. Mist hovered low above its surface, and the sun, still rising, painted the water in pale gold and silver. The air smelled fresh, of wet earth, crushed grass, and distant cottonwoods. Birds called from the branches. A fish broke the surface with a soft splash. It looked peaceful, but beneath the surface, the current was strong. Elijah walked to the bank and crouched low, dipping his fingers into the river. It was icy cold, even in the warmth of spring. The kind of cold that bit into the skin and lingered in the bones. Behind him, the wagon train had come to a halt. The animals stirred, restless. Children watched from wagon seats, eyes wide. Mothers wrapped shawls tighter around their shoulders. Mary stood nearby, the baby nestled in the sling across her chest, Lucy coughing quietly at her side. There were two choices. Ford the river, driving the wagons through the water, risking the current. Or cork the wagons, sealing the seams with pitch and tar, turning them into crude boats to float across. Neither was simple. Neither was safe. The scouts went first. Men on horseback. They rode into the shallows, water splashing up around their stirrups. The horses hesitated, then pressed forward, their legs churning as they moved deeper. The current tugged at them. Strong. Relentless. Cold. When the water reached the bellies of the horses, the riders turned back. "It's passable," one of them called, voice loud but uneasy. "But just barely." Preparation began at once. Wheels were checked and tightened. Wagons were unloaded slightly to lighten the weight. Tar was heated and rubbed into cracks. Barrels were strapped down. Boxes were tied shut. Ropes were uncoiled. Prayers were whispered. Children were told to stay near their mothers. Dogs were leashed. Chickens were crated. The oxen were led into the water first, guided with firm voices and soft hands. Their eyes were wide, nostrils flaring. They did not like it, but they obeyed. The cold made them shiver. Then came the wagons. One by one, they entered the water, wheels sinking into the soft riverbed, canvas tops swaying slightly in the breeze. The sound was strange, water slapping wood, the creak of axles, the low rumble of hooves through gravel. Mary held her breath as their wagon inched forward. Elijah walked beside it, his boots already soaked, hand on the reins. "Easy now," he murmured to the oxen. "Keep steady." Halfway across, the current grew stronger. The river pulled at the wheels, tugged at the boxes inside. Water spilled over the bottom boards. Mary clutched the baby tighter, her other hand gripping the edge of the wagon. Lucy whimpered softly. The wagon swayed, then groaned. For a moment, it felt as though it might tip. Elijah shouted, urging the oxen forward. They strained, hooves slipping, muscles trembling. And then, slowly, almost stubbornly, the wagon surged forward once more, finding firmer ground beneath the far bank. They made it. Wet. Shaken. But safe. Not everyone was so lucky. One wagon behind them tilted too far. A barrel shifted. The oxen panicked. The wagon dipped hard to one side and water rushed in. Screams echoed. A boy fell in, pulled briefly under before hands grabbed him and dragged him out. One crate floated downstream. Another disappeared beneath the surface. The wagon itself made it across, but damaged, soaked, and missing supplies. That night, the family mourned the loss of their flour and bedding, and gave thanks that no one had drowned. Afterward, the camp was quiet. Clothes were hung to dry. Fires were built to warm soaked skin. The scent of wet canvas and singed wood filled the air. The oxen were fed and rubbed down. Children played again, cautiously, their laughter returning like birds after a storm. Mary sat near the fire, her skirt damp around the hem, rocking the baby slowly. Lucy lay nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her cough softer now. Elijah took out the Bible and read aloud. Just a few lines. Something about valleys and green pastures. And though no one said it, many in the wagon train listened in silence. The next day, they moved on. The river now behind them. Its memory tucked away, heavy, but survived. Over the weeks, they would cross many more rivers. The Little Blue, the Platte, the Sweet Water, each one different. Some shallow, nothing more than a gentle splash of hooves through muddy banks. Others deep, with currents that whispered warnings to the wise. Some could be ferried, if the timing was right and a crossing post had been built. But often, they were alone, just wagons, ropes, hands, and hope. River crossings became a test. Of planning, of patience, of courage, and of trust, in the wagons, in the animals, and in each other. Still, there were moments of beauty too. One morning, after a calm crossing, Elijah stood on the bank, looking back at the water. The sun was rising behind him, casting a warm glow across the surface. A mist still lingered, moving like breath above the current. He watched a deer on the far side, its slender legs just touching the edge of the river, its eyes calm, unafraid. The deer bent its head, drank, then vanished into the trees. He turned to Mary, standing beside him. "We made it," he said. She nodded, eyes fixed on the same quiet water. "For now." And so the wagons rolled on, their wheels marked by mud and memory, their canvas tops streaked with water, their people changed just a little more. Each river left something behind, and each crossing brought them closer. To Oregon, to home, to the unknown horizon beyond the bend. The plains stretched wide and silent now, endless and golden beneath the rising sun. The wagon train had crossed rivers, conquered muddy trails, and braved storms. They had laughed, they had sung, they had worked side by side beneath stars and clouds. But now, a new hardship began to creep in, not with thunder or shouting or fire, but quietly. It came in coughs. It came in fevers. It came in silence. Disease had arrived on the trail. It began with a little girl named Ruth. She was 5 years old, the youngest of 3, with straw-colored hair, always tangled, and a giggle that echoed up and down the wagon line like birdsong. She had been playing the day before, collecting round stones by the trail and lining them up like little dolls. But that morning, she didn't rise. Her mother found her curled beneath a quilt, cheeks flushed, breath shallow. She was warm, too warm, and she did not speak. At first, they thought it was just fatigue, too much sun, too little water, perhaps a chill from the river crossing days before. But by evening, she had not improved. And by morning, 2 more children were coughing. There were no doctors on the trail. Only experience. Only remedies passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Only hope. Mary brought what herbs she had, dried yarrow and willow bark. She boiled water in a tin cup and soaked cloth in cool stream water to bring the children's heat down. Elijah stayed back with the others to repair a broken wheel. They said nothing to the children. They worked quietly, with steady hands and calm voices. But inside, a shadow had begun to grow. As the wagon train moved forward, a strange hush settled over it. Gone was the singing in the mornings, the chatter between wagons, the laughter of children running between the wheels. Now there were whispers. Now there were lowered voices and glances toward the sick wagon. Some tried not to look. Others brought broth and water and wood for fires. No one said the word. Not out loud. Cholera. It was the most feared word on the trail. A sickness that could take a healthy man before sundown. A plague that left trails of graves beside the wheel ruts. No one wanted to speak it, but all feared it. The first true sign came one grey morning, when a woman in the rear wagon collapsed without warning. She had been holding a tin plate when her knees buckled. The plate clattered to the ground, and she fell with it. Her husband cried out. People rushed to help. She was hot to the touch, her breath fast and thin. She moaned once, then went quiet. By nightfall, she was gone. A shallow grave was dug beside the trail, lined with stones and pine boughs. Her name was carved into a scrap of wood, and a simple cross was placed beside it. There was no funeral, just silence. The wagons moved on. Each day brought new coughs. Children with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. Adults with glassy eyes, stumbling beside their animals. Blankets soaked with sweat. Hands gripping tin cups with shaking fingers. Mary stayed busy. Boiling water. Washing linens. Feeding broth to those too weak to chew. Whispering stories to calm the frightened. Elijah helped build a quarantine wagon, a place for the sick to rest away from others. It was lined with canvas and hay, shaded as best they could manage. But the trail did not wait. It stretched onward, unbending, unforgiving. At night, the fires burned lower. People spoke in murmurs. Some read quietly from their Bibles. Others simply stared into the flames. Children were kept close. Faces were watched. Every cough drew attention. But amid the fear, there was also kindness. One family gave their last jar of honey to sweeten the bitter herbs. Another shared their only bar of soap. And when Ruth, the little girl who fell ill first, began to open her eyes and speak again, there was a quiet joy that passed from wagon to wagon like a rising sun. They rested for 2 days near a slow-moving creek lined with cottonwoods. The air there was soft and cool. The grass long and sweet-smelling. Birds called gently from the trees. It was peaceful. They washed clothes in the stream, letting them dry in the sun. Children waded in the shallows, laughter slowly returning. The sick were given shade and silence. Mary sat beside a boy from another family, gently brushing his hair from his forehead. His name was Benjamin. He was 12. Strong, but worn thin by fever. "Tell me a story," he whispered. So she did. A quiet story. One with horses and a brave little girl and a cabin in the woods. Her voice was soft, slow, and steady. He smiled faintly, eyes fluttering closed. By the third morning, the wind shifted. The air felt cooler, cleaner. No new coughs. No new fever. No new graves. They moved forward again. The wagon train quieter, yes, but also stronger. Changed, but still together. Illness would come again. The trail had many more miles to offer, and not all of them would be kind. There would be more fevers, more cold nights, more rough days and anxious mornings. But there would also be healing. There would be resilience. There would be mothers and fathers and children holding each other in the darkness and whispering stories and songs that would live long after the trail ended. Mary would remember that week forever. The hush, the heat, the wild herbs steaming in the cup, the child's fingers brushing hers in sleep, the simple gratitude in a mother's eyes when her daughter opened her eyes again. Elijah would remember too. The weight of the shovel, the stones piled beside the trail, the kindness of a stranger who handed him a blanket without a word. And so, they walked on, westward, toward Oregon, toward land they had never seen, toward hope, still burning like a lantern through the dust and fear. They did not forget what they had lost, but they did not stop. And that was enough. The prairie had its moods. Some days were still, the horizon soft, the sky gentle, and the air warm and steady. But other days, the wind would rise. And sometimes, the prairie would roar. It began with a hush, a stillness in the tall grass, the kind of quiet that made the oxen stop chewing and lift their heads, the kind of quiet that made the birds disappear from the sky, and the insects vanish into the earth. The clouds gathered slowly at first, just a few wisps drifting across the blue, then thickened, darkened, and swirled into something deeper. A line of black crept across the western sky, low and heavy. It moved like a wall, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. The wind picked up next, not fierce at first, but uncertain. A cool, gusting breath that rustled the canvas tops and sent dry leaves tumbling across the trail. Mary noticed it first. She was tending the morning fire, the baby in her arms, when she looked up and stilled. "Elijah," she called softly. He turned, saw the sky, and nodded. "Storm's coming." The wagon train began to prepare. Tarps were tied down tight. Wagons were pulled into a loose circle near the base of a rise, where a few scraggly trees offered a little cover. The oxen grew uneasy. Their eyes watched the horizon, their feet shifting in the dry soil. Children were gathered. Blankets passed around. Fires were doused, and food left half-cooked. Thunder rolled in the distance, not sharp, but deep. A low, groaning sound like a drum echoing across the plains. Mary bundled the children beneath the wagon, wrapping them in dry quilts. The baby clung to her chest. Lucy held her hand, eyes wide. "Will it be bad?" she whispered. "No," Mary said softly, brushing her hair back. "Just loud." The storm struck suddenly. A flash of light split the sky, followed by a thunderclap that made the wagon frame shiver. Then came the rain. Not a drizzle, but a deluge. It poured from the heavens in thick, slanted sheets. The wind howled through the camp, bending the grasses sideways, snapping small branches, and tugging at anything not tied down. Canvas covers rippled like sails at sea. Wagon wheels sank slightly into the softening earth. Water pooled in boots, in crates, in the hollow tracks left by weeks of travel. The smell of rain was everywhere, sharp, clean, earthy, like the world had been washed and wrung out. Children whimpered, then fell silent. Fathers sat beside their wagons, soaked to the bone, shoulders hunched. Mothers whispered old lullabies over the roar of wind and water. Elijah stood at the front of the wagon, gripping the reins. Rain streamed down his face. His hands were cold and stiff. But he stayed, watching the horizon, waiting for any change in the storm's rhythm. Mary remained under the wagon, shielding the children with her body, her back pressed to the canvas floor above, the baby tucked close, heartbeat to heartbeat. The wind rattled the spokes. The rain danced on the tin cups and iron pots. The thunder moved in waves, loud, then quiet, then loud again. Time blurred in the storm. Was it 1 hour? 2? No one could say. But eventually, the thunder grew softer. The rain lightened. The wind settled. And then, the sky cracked open. Just a sliver at first, a line of pale light on the far horizon. Then golden beams. Then warmth. Then the slow return of sound, the chirp of birds, the shuffle of animals, the creak of wet leather. The storm had passed. The camp emerged in pieces. Blankets were hung from trees and wagon sides to dry. Fires were rekindled. Pots tipped and poured. Wet shoes were emptied and wrung out. The trail itself glistened, its muddy ruts catching the sunlight like small streams. Mary's hair clung to her cheeks, but she smiled as Lucy helped her shake out the quilt. Elijah removed his boots, turned them upside down, and laughed when the water ran out like a stream from a pipe. It had been frightening, yes, but now that it was over, the world felt clean, washed, new. Storms like these came more often as spring deepened. Sometimes it was rain, sometimes wind, sometimes the heavy pressure of a sky that looked too low. The wagon train learned to move with the weather, to read the wind, to feel the shift in the grass, to smell the rain before it came. They learned to pitch tents quickly, to cover food in oiled cloth, to brace wagon wheels with stone, to find shelter even where there was none. One evening, a windstorm hit just as the last light of day was fading. There was no rain, only wind. It howled through the camp like a living thing, pulling at hair and hats and loose ties. It knocked over cooking pots and sent ashes flying. It whistled through the cracks in the wagons, rattling boards and creaking canvas. Mary lay beneath the wagon with the children, shielding them from the dust. The baby fussed. Lucy trembled. The air was filled with grit and whispers. Elijah sat near the tongue of the wagon, leaning into the wind, holding onto the reins of the oxen so they wouldn't bolt. And in the roar of the storm, no one spoke. They simply endured. Together. By morning, the wind was gone. Only silence remained. And when the sun rose, it lit the land in a soft gold that made the wet grass shine and the canvas wagons steam gently in the warmth. Birds returned. The air smelled of dust and ozone and soaked earth. And the trail, though muddy, waited quietly ahead. Storms on the plains taught many lessons. They taught patience. They taught respect. They taught the power of nature and the strength of a wagon train working together. They reminded the pioneers that they were small, small against the sky, against the wind, against time. But not helpless. Never helpless. Mary would always remember those nights. Not for the fear, though it was real, but for the closeness. The way her children curled into her side. The way Elijah held her hand when the wind was at its loudest. The way the firelight returned afterward, soft and orange, flickering gently against the wet walls of the wagon. There was peace there, even in the storm. And so, the wagon train continued, past wet hills, through churned mud, across the drying trails and the morning mist. Every day was a little stronger, every mile a little closer. The sky still changed, the wind still spoke, the storms still came. But they had learned to listen, and to keep moving through it all. The trail could be lonely, but it was never truly empty. Across the wide prairie, beneath the endless sky, others moved unseen. Traders, hunters, scouts, wanderers, and sometimes those with darker intentions. It was said, in the quiet corners of wagon camps and whispered tales passed over cook fires, that bandits roamed the farther reaches of the trail. Not often, not every week, but enough to stay in people's minds, just beneath the surface of their thoughts. At first, it was just rumor. Stories passed from one wagon train to the next. A man robbed on the trail outside Fort Laramie. A family that lost their mules during the night. A wagon left burned by the river, stripped of flour, bullets, and blankets. No one wanted to believe it, but no one ignored it either. It was a moonless night when the first real fear set in. The wagon train had camped in a narrow valley between low ridges. The land there was quiet, the grass long, and the trees bent low from years of wind. They had eaten well, beans cooked with wild onions, bread warmed on flat stones beside the fire. Children had laughed that evening, chasing fireflies near the creek, their bare feet whispering through the grass. Mary had bathed the baby in a shallow tin basin, humming softly. Elijah had sat polishing his rifle, not out of worry, just routine. The sky darkened gently, the stars flickered overhead, and all seemed calm. But sometime after midnight, a sound drifted through the camp. Not wind, not thunder, not an animal. Footsteps. Soft, slow, measured, human. Elijah opened his eyes in the dark. He had been sleeping lightly, as always, on a bedroll near the front wheel of the wagon. The baby stirred quietly inside. Mary didn't wake. He waited, still, listening. Another step, then silence, then two more. Not close, but not far. He rose slowly, careful not to stir the others. He reached for his rifle. The metal was cool in his hands. Nearby, another man stirred, Jacob, the guide. He was already awake, crouched beside the embers of the dying fire, eyes sharp. "You hear it?" Elijah whispered. Jacob nodded. "South Ridge." They didn't raise an alarm. Instead, they moved together, quietly waking two more men, forming a small watch. Four figures moving like shadows between wagons, lanterns covered, boots soundless on the dry ground. The rest of the camp slept on, undisturbed. Nothing happened that night. No attack. No theft. Just that sound, and then stillness. But in the morning, they found tracks. Boot prints. Not from any known scout. Not from their own. Leading in from the trees. Pausing behind a wagon. Then retreating. Nothing had been taken. But something had come close. Very close. That day, the mood changed. Elijah watched as the others checked their rifles, tightened ropes, counted bags. Mary packed the flour deeper in the wagon. She said little, but her hands moved quickly, her eyes often on the horizon. The children sensed it too. No laughter that morning. No running through the grass. Even the oxen, sensing the tension in their handlers, moved slower, more cautiously. The trail that day was long and hot. The sky hung low. The sun beat down like iron. Dust rose in every step, clinging to eyebrows, teeth, and skin. But no one complained. They just moved forward. That night, they formed a tighter circle. The wagons were drawn close, with a central fire and watch shifts established. 2 men at a time, rotating through the night. Elijah took the second shift, walking slowly around the perimeter, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The moon was thin now, and the stars above shimmered faintly through high clouds. He walked past the oxen, resting in the tall grass. Past the wagons, where mothers slept curled around children. Past the stream, where frogs croaked softly in the reeds. He listened, and he waited. Most nights passed quietly, but once, just once, he spotted something. A flicker of movement on the hilltop, just a silhouette, there for a breath, then gone. He raised his rifle, but he did not fire. Instead, he watched, listened, and let the moment pass. There was no attack, no words, no answer, only wind. The weeks that followed brought no violence, but the possibility of danger changed the way they traveled. The wagon train became more cautious, more organized, more watchful. Children stayed close. Fires burned smaller. No one wandered far from camp without another by their side. Even Mary, who had always walked with the children in the morning light, now stayed close to the wagon. Her eyes still soft, her smile still warm, but her ears sharper, her senses tuned to the world in new ways. And yet, amid the caution, life continued. Beans still boiled in the pot. Children still told jokes. Fathers still mended wheels and shaved kindling. And mothers still sang lullabies to sleepy babies. Fear did not stop the trail. It simply joined the journey, like another traveler, silent, watchful, walking quietly beside them. One evening, long after the danger had passed, Elijah sat with Jacob by the fire. The wind was low, the sky soft with stars, the night warm and still. "Do you think they'll come back?" Elijah asked. Jacob shook his head. "Maybe, maybe not. But they know now. We're ready." Elijah nodded. "Doesn't feel right," he said, "to worry about people when there's already so much else. Weather, sickness, rivers." Jacob looked into the fire, then said quietly, "Sometimes, people are the hardest part." Mary joined them later, carrying a tin cup of tea, the baby fast asleep in her arms. She didn't ask about bandits. Didn't ask about rifles or shadows on hills. She simply said, "We're still here." And that was enough. From then on, the watch rotations continued. Even when the land grew safer. Even when the talk of bandits faded. Even when the nights were soft again. Because the pioneers had learned something important. Caution could live beside peace. Strength could live beside kindness. And even in a world filled with uncertainty, they could still protect what mattered most. So the wagon train rolled on. Through sun and wind. Through grass and gravel. Through fear, and past it. And somewhere in the distance, Oregon waited, quiet, vast, and still unseen. The Oregon Trail was not all storms and sickness and the fear of strangers. Sometimes, what tested the settlers most was the trail itself. The small moments. The quiet accidents. The things that happened in a single blink and stayed with a person for days, or weeks, or forever. It was late morning when the accident happened. The sky was a wide, brilliant blue, the kind that made the dust shimmer and the canvas wagon tops glow like cream-colored lanterns. They were traveling at an easy pace, the oxen moving steadily, the wind blowing softly from the east. Mary was walking beside the wagon, humming a quiet tune as the baby slept against her chest. Lucy was a few steps ahead, pointing out grasshoppers and wildflowers. Then came the sound. A shout. A crash. And silence. Everyone turned at once. One of the boys, 12 years old, perhaps, had fallen from the side of his wagon. He had been riding on the tongue, where the oxen's yoke connected to the wood, feet swinging just above the dirt. It was something children did often, a small thrill in a slow world. But this time, he had slipped. The rear wheel had passed over his leg. The wagon stopped immediately. People rushed to help. Elijah pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside the boy. His name was Peter. He was pale, biting his lip hard, trying not to cry. But tears were already welling in his eyes, and his face was damp with sweat. The leg was bent at an unnatural angle. No blood, not much, but swelling fast. Elijah looked up and met the eyes of Peter's father. A single, unspoken word passed between them. Broken. They laid Peter gently in the grass and splintered the leg with a length of hickory and strips of cloth torn from a spare undershirt. Mary brought water, and a biscuit soaked in broth. Others stood back, silent, watching, waiting. The boy cried once, when the bone was set, a high, short sound that carried down the line of wagons. Then he lay still, eyes closed, hands clenched, breathing fast. His mother sat beside him, brushing his hair from his forehead. She didn't speak, just held his hand, just kept him close. For the next few days, the wagon train slowed. They made camp early. took breaks more often. Let the oxen drink longer. Let the boy rest. The other children played quietly near the wagons. Lucy drew flowers in the dirt with a stick. The baby slept more than usual, soothed by the stillness. No one talked much about the accident, but everyone felt it. A reminder, again, of how easily things could change. It wasn't the only accident that month. One afternoon, a kettle tipped off a fire pit and splashed boiling water across a woman's leg. Her dress soaked it instantly, the steam rising in a sharp hiss. She screamed. Mary and another woman ran to help. They tore the fabric away and poured cool water over the burn, covering it with damp cloths. It blistered fast. Angry, red, and raw. They kept it wrapped, kept it clean. Let her rest. Each night, Elijah helped the woman's husband with their oxen, and Mary brought broth to their wagon. It took nearly 2 weeks before she could walk without flinching. These were not stories people told. They were not brave tales or wild adventures. They were quiet, painful, personal. They happened when the wind was calm and the sun was warm, not during storms or disasters. A child leaning too far, a foot slipping on a rock, a rusty nail catching the hem of a skirt, a tent pole falling just so. In a world without doctors or hospitals, every bruise, every cut, every misstep had weight. One man in the train had only one good hand. He had lost the other long ago, not on the trail, but in a sawmill accident back in Indiana. Yet he never complained. He carved pegs, mended shoes, and drove his wagon like any other man. When a child asked him how he did it all with one hand, he just smiled and said, "I use the other twice as well." Another traveler walked with a limp from a twisted ankle weeks earlier. He had refused to slow the train, choosing instead to wrap the joint tight with strips of wool and walk through the pain. At night, he'd sit by the fire, rubbing the swelling with bare fat and humming to himself. Pain became part of the trail. Not dramatic, just there, like the dust, like the creaking wheels, like the fading stars at dawn. Mary kept a small pouch of salves and bandages in the wagon, herbs for swelling, cloths boiled and dried, a sliver of soap saved for cuts. She checked on the boy with the broken leg each morning. His smile came back slowly, his laughter even slower, but it returned. One evening, she found him sitting upright in the wagon, carving a figure from a piece of driftwood. "It's a buffalo," he said proudly. Mary looked at the little wooden shape, rough, uneven, and full of effort. "It's beautiful," she said. Elijah had his own share of injuries. A splinter that festered, a bruise on his ribs from lifting a full barrel the wrong way, a sore shoulder from days of yoke and rope and pulling wheels out of ruts. He never mentioned them, just worked slower when needed, slept harder at night, held Mary's hand when the days felt longer than usual. Injuries were part of the rhythm. The trail demanded much, from every part of the body. Feet blistered, eyes strained from sun and dust, hands cracked and bled, shoulders ached, knees stiffened, and backs bent. But each morning they rose, stretched, rubbed tired muscles, and walked on. And still there was joy. Children ran again. New games were invented using sticks and stones. Someone made a whistle from a reed near the river. Someone else taught a quiet song by the fire. And when Peter, the boy with the broken leg, was able to stand, just briefly, just leaning against the wagon, the camp clapped softly in quiet celebration. No speech, no fuss, just a smile, and hope, and the strength to keep going. Accidents would come again. That was the way of the trail. But so would healing, and courage, and the soft, steady hands of people who looked out for one another, even in the smallest, quietest of ways. And so, the wagon train rolled forward, bruised, tired, but never broken, and Oregon, still far off, waited beneath the same sky. For many pioneers, the land they traveled felt wild and untouched, but that belief, like so many, was shaped by distance, by what they hadn't seen or didn't yet understand. The truth was simpler, and older, and deeper. The Oregon Trail did not pass through empty land. It passed through homelands, places lived in, prayed over, hunted on, and passed down for generations. From the tall grasslands of the Platte to the riverbanks near the Rockies, the wagon trains moved through a world already rich with history. This was the land of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, the Pawnee, the Nez Perce, the Cayuse, the Umatilla, and many others. Tribes whose names the pioneers sometimes mispronounced, sometimes misunderstood, and sometimes feared. But often, they simply met, face to face, person to person, under the same sky. The first encounter for Elijah, Mary, and the others came just beyond the Platte River crossing. It was late afternoon. The wind was soft, the sun warm. The wagons moved slow over gentle hills, wheels leaving faint grooves in the yellow grass. Up ahead, two figures appeared on horseback, silhouetted against the light. They did not approach fast. They did not wave. They simply watched, still and silent on the rise. Elijah noticed them first. He raised a hand and stopped the train. Others joined him, shielding their eyes against the sun. "They're watching," someone said quietly. Elijah nodded. "Let them." The two riders remained where they were for a while, then turned and rode off, disappearing over the hill. The train stood still for a few minutes longer. Then, with a quiet signal from Jacob the scout, they moved on. By the time camp was made that evening, the story had already grown. "Scouts," someone said, "probably checking the size of our group." "Could be peaceful," said another. "Could be planning something," whispered a third. Elijah said nothing. He helped Mary unload the cooking pot and lit the fire with slow, steady hands. "Whoever they are," he said finally, "they saw us. And we saw them. That matters." 2 days later, the encounter changed. This time, the visitors came into camp. There were 5 of them, men on horseback. Young, proud, and calm. They wore woven vests, long braids, and beaded sashes. Their faces were strong and unreadable. They carried spears and bows, but did not raise them. The wagon train paused everything. Children were pulled close. Rifles remained nearby, but lowered. The fire crackled between the two groups. Jacob stepped forward to greet them, offering a soft hello in halting Shoshone. One of the visitors replied in English, clear, quiet, respectful. "We see many wagons," he said. "We trade if you need." Elijah stepped forward, slow and open-handed. He offered coffee, and in return, received dried berries and jerky. There was no laughter, no warmth, but no fear either. Just observation, exchange, a slow, human kind of curiosity. Mary watched from the wagon, the baby on her hip, her eyes steady. "They're just like us," she whispered. "Maybe better dressed," Elijah muttered, nodding at the beadwork. That night, the camp buzzed with questions. What tribe were they? Why were they watching us for days? Will they come back? But no one had answers. Only stories, passed from traveler to traveler, sometimes based in truth, sometimes not. In truth, most encounters with native peoples on the trail were peaceful. Tribes traded food, furs, and horses. Some offered guidance through rivers or valleys, and many simply watched from a distance. The pioneers were often nervous, unfamiliar with customs, unsure how to act. And the tribes were cautious too, wary of these long lines of wagons carrying strange goods, strange weapons, and strange intentions across ancestral ground. There was no shared language, no shared history, just this thin stretch of trail, and the hope that caution might mean peace. But not every meeting was easy. There were misunderstandings over stolen livestock, trampled grass, disrespectful gestures. There were arguments when trade turned tense. There were warnings ignored, and boundaries crossed. And, sometimes, there was violence. Elijah heard of it in bits and pieces, from riders passing east, from messages carved into trees or whispered at supply forts. One wagon train had fired without warning when approached. Another had lost a man to an arrow, fired from the trees near the Snake River after a deal went bad. Another had vanished entirely. Just a burnt-out circle and 2 graves marked unknown. It was hard to know what was true. So many voices. So many fears. But Elijah believed what Jacob said one night by the fire, long after the camp had gone quiet. "Every man out here wants something," Jacob murmured. "Land, food, safety, honor. That goes for us. That goes for them. What matters is how we ask for it." Mary agreed. She taught the children to wave with an open palm, to smile when they saw riders at a distance, and to offer food without strings. Not because it was required, but because it was right. "They were here before us," she said. "That's worth respect." The last time they saw a tribal group on the trail, it was high summer. The prairie was golden and swaying in the wind. A group of women and children watched from the far side of a creek, their eyes calm, their movements slow. One of the children held a string of feathers. Another pointed at the wagons. The mothers said nothing. Elijah raised a hand in greeting. The eldest woman nodded once. That was all. But it was something. The trail did not pause for diplomacy. It moved forward. Always forward. But the memory of those encounters stayed in the wagons. In the letters sent home. In the stories told later by firelight. Of the man who traded coffee for moccasins. Of the girl who gave her only apple to a visiting boy. Of the arguments avoided with a kind word and a slow step. And of the fear, still present, still real, that not every meeting would end with peace. Elijah knew that too. As did Mary. As did everyone. But they walked on with open eyes and a quiet hope. Because not all conflict was necessary. And not all strangers were enemies. And not all land was meant to be taken without thought. The land ahead belonged to many. To rivers and winds. To herds and flocks. To tribes that had lived there long before wagons ever touched the soil. The pioneers were visitors. They always had been. And those who remembered that truth walked more wisely. There was no real church on the trail. No steeple. No pews. No ringing bell at dawn. But there were sacred moments. Moments when time slowed. When even the wind held its breath. And one of those moments was when someone died. It happened more often than they wanted to believe. Not always from disease. Not always from injury. Sometimes it was simply the body, surrendering to the journey. Too much heat. Too little rest. Too much hope riding on too little strength. On a warm, dry morning in early June, the wagon train moved quietly across the plains. The land rolled gently, green hills dotted with pale flowers, tall grasses bending beneath the breeze. The oxen walked steadily. The wheels turned slow and creaking, carving deep lines in the soft soil. Mary walked beside the wagon, the baby asleep against her chest. Lucy held a small bouquet of wild daisies, gathered just an hour earlier. She had been humming a soft song. But now, The humming had stopped. The wagons up ahead had halted. Something had happened. Elijah was already at the front, crouched beside one of the older women in the train, a woman named Clara. She had been traveling with her brother and his family, bundled in quilts in the back of their wagon. She had been unwell for days. Breath shallow. Skin pale and cool. But she had smiled. She had prayed. She had whispered that she would see Oregon. That morning, she hadn't opened her eyes. And now, she was still. The camp formed a slow circle around the wagon. Not out of fear. Not out of curiosity. But out of quiet respect. Mary joined Elijah, gently taking Lucy's hand. She did not speak. The baby stirred, then fell back into sleep. The wind moved gently through the grass, lifting the loose strands of Clara's white hair. The burial took place not far from a tree, a lone cottonwood standing tall beside a rise in the land. Its trunk was thick, its leaves a soft green that shimmered in the sunlight. The soil there was good, soft enough to dig, yet firm enough to hold. Several of the men worked the earth with shovels, their sleeves rolled high, their hands silent. The scrape of metal against dirt was the only sound for some time. Children stood with their mothers, watching, unsure of what to say. Even the oxen, usually restless, seemed still. When the grave was ready, Clara was wrapped gently in linen and laid to rest. A hymn was sung, low and slow, voices trembling in the wind. Jacob, the guide, read from a small leather-bound Bible. His voice was calm, cracked only slightly by age and dust. She was kind, he said. She was strong. She made it farther than many would have thought. And she will ride the rest of the way with us, in our memories. A simple wooden cross was placed at the head of the grave. Carved into it, CL, age 62, gone west. No last name. No long message. Just those two words. Gone west. Because on the trail, that meant something. It meant not lost. Not forgotten. But passed on, to rest, to peace, to whatever came next beneath that wide, endless sky. That night, the camp was quiet. No songs. No stories. Just the crackle of fire. The soft sound of boots brushing grass. And the distant hoot of an owl in the trees. Mary sat beside the fire, holding the baby against her shoulder. Lucy was curled beside her, her eyes wide and still. Why did she die? Lucy asked softly. Mary thought for a long moment before answering. She was tired, she said. Her body couldn't keep going. But her spirit, her love for us, that goes on. Lucy nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, will we die out here? Mary wrapped her arms around her daughter, drawing her close. We'll do everything we can not to, she whispered. We'll be careful. We'll be strong. And we'll take care of each other. That was the truth of the trail. There were no guarantees. Only effort. Only hope. Only care. As the wagon train moved on the next morning, Elijah looked back once, just once, toward the little grave by the tree. He tipped his hat, said nothing, and walked on. Clara's grave was not the only one. There were others, many others, scattered along the trail, each marked by stone, wood, or memory. Some bore names. Some did not. Some were visited again in later years. Others were left to the wind and grass. But each one told a story. Of someone who tried. Of someone who believed. Of someone who gave everything for the chance of something better. And when pioneers passed a grave, they often grew quiet. Even the children. Even the animals seemed to know. Because grief on the trail was shared. Not loudly. Not with weeping and wailing. But in soft glances. In extra firewood chopped. in a tin cup of broth handed without words. Mary made a habit of gathering flowers when they passed a grave. Sometimes wild roses. Sometimes only weeds that looked a little like daisies. She'd place them gently by the marker as they passed, whispering a blessing too soft to hear. Lucy copied her. In this way, the dead were remembered, not with marble, but with motion, with kindness, with respect. One evening, weeks later, they passed another wagon train headed east, a rare thing on the Oregon Trail. Tired faces. A wagon with a broken wheel. A man with a sling on his arm. They had turned back, they said. Too much loss. Too many graves. They offered no shame, and none was needed. Turning back was hard. Just as hard as going on. Mary gave them a small sack of dried apples. Elijah offered them fresh rope. And the two groups parted quietly, fading from each other's view across the golden grass. Death on the trail did not always come with a warning. Sometimes it was slow, a cough that lingered. Sometimes fast, a snake bite, a stampede, a wagon tipping just wrong. But in every case, it reminded the travelers of what mattered. Holding hands a little tighter. Speaking with a little more kindness. Watching the sunrise not with haste, but with reverence. And so they walked. Through grief. Through memory. Through miles lined with stories carved into wood and stone. Some cried in private. Some prayed under the stars. Some sang lullabies a little softer. But all moved forward, carrying the ones they lost within them. Always. There were few buildings on the Oregon Trail. No towns. No inns. No taverns with warm stew waiting by the fire. But every few hundred miles came a fort. A place with real walls. With people behind them. With barrels of flour and bolts of cloth and letters from home. They were like islands, scattered along the wide Prairie Sea. Not luxurious. Not safe in every way. But solid. And still. The first one they reached was Fort Kearny. It rose up from the plains like something out of a dream. Low stone walls, a few wooden buildings, a yard surrounded by wagons from other trains, and the rising scent of wood smoke and livestock. Mary saw it first. She was walking beside the wagon as usual, her shawl pulled close, the baby resting gently in her arms. When she caught sight of the flagpole on the horizon, her breath caught. "There it is," she whispered. Lucy tugged at her hand. "Is that Oregon?" Mary smiled faintly. "No, sweet one. But it's a good place to rest." The trail had been long up to that point. Their flour barrel was low. The beans were nearly gone. The coffee had turned thin, just enough for scent, not strength. Clothes were torn. Boots had worn through. And the children's cheeks, once full, had grown lean from the miles. So when they reached Fort Kearny, it felt like stepping into a different world. Not civilization, exactly, but something near it. There were people everywhere. Some arriving, some leaving, some camping nearby, waiting for injured travelers to recover. Others trading goods beneath the canvas shade of supply stalls. Barrels of hardtack, sacks of cornmeal, tins of lard, boxes of dried apples, bundles of rope, shovels, lantern oil, candles, bullets, and blankets. Everything cost more here than it did back east. Much more. But everything was needed. And so, one by one, the families lined up, waiting with small pouches of coins, with tools to trade, with fur or cloth, or even an extra pair of boots. Mary traded one of her quilts, a deep red one, stitched with white stars. It was beautiful, warm, and heavy with memory. But they needed sugar, and soap, And 2 tin cups, since one had cracked last week beyond repair. She folded the quilt slowly, kissed it once, and handed it over. The trader, a man with a thick mustache and kindly eyes, gave her the sugar with a respectful nod. "No change, he said. Mary just smiled. "That's all right." Elijah bought a new knife. His old one had rusted from too many river crossings. He also bought a wheel spoke, just in case, and a bag of nails. The trader offered whiskey. Elijah declined. He needed clarity more than comfort. Lucy was gifted a peppermint stick by a soldier in a wool jacket. She smiled, wide and shy, her fingers sticky with the red stripes. It was the first sweet thing she had tasted in weeks. The baby watched her with wide eyes and a gentle coo. That evening, the camp was filled with laughter. There were fires everywhere, casting soft orange light against the canvas of tents and the dust of the earth. Some travelers sang. Others told stories. One boy played a harmonica with slow, sleepy notes that drifted like mist into the night. Mary washed the baby's clothes in warm water for the first time in many days. She scrubbed until her fingers were sore, then held the wet cloth to her face, breathing in the clean scent. Elijah sat beside her, cleaning his rifle, the firelight flickering in the barrel's reflection. For just one night, it felt like they had stopped moving. Not forever, but long enough. The next morning, Elijah checked the message board posted near the trading post. There were notes scratched in pencil, charcoal, even knife tip. John Taylor, wait at Fort Laramie. I will catch up. Seth. Looking for missing bay mare, white blaze, left hind scar. Reward. To the Millers, baby girl born, healthy and strong. God is good. The letters were stiff from sun and dust, but each one mattered. They were like footprints left in the prairie, signs of lives unfolding. Mary found a letter, too, one addressed to no one in particular. It was simply pinned to the wall with a square nail, folded once, words inside. Mama passed just past the big blue. We buried her under a cartonwood. The Lord gave us strength. We are still heading west. She didn't take it down. She just stood there quietly, hand resting over her chest. Lucy found a girl her age at a nearby wagon. They didn't speak much, just exchanged wildflowers and showed each other their dolls. Then the other girl handed her a carved button in the shape of a bird. "I made it," she said proudly. Lucy beamed. "Thank you." She didn't stop smiling the rest of the day. By noon, it was time to move again. The train reassembled. The oxen were yoked. Wagons pulled slowly out of the circle. Other families waved. Some joined the train. Some stayed behind, waiting for illness to pass or wagons to mend. Elijah glanced once more at the flag waving above the fort, a quiet, distant rhythm in the breeze. Then he turned back to the trail. Forts like Kearney were few and far between. The next would be Fort Laramie, many days ahead, near the base of distant mountains and the rising scent of pine. Others would come later still, Fort Hall, Fort Boise, and the final stop before the descent into Oregon's valleys. Each one a small pause. Each one a breath in the long sentence of the journey. Not all forts were safe. Some were overrun with desperate men. Some had guards who charged high fees. Some had sickness in their walls. But most were what the pioneers needed most. A reminder that they were not alone. Mary would remember Fort Kearney not for what they bought, but for the peppermint, for the warm water, for the way Lucy smiled for hours, for the way the camp, just for one night, felt like a place, not just a passage. Elijah would remember the knife, the sound of stories drifting across firelight, and the way Mary had washed her hands twice, not because they were dirty, but because the water was warm. The trail was long, and much still lay ahead. But that night, as the campfires burned low and the wagons swayed gently in the wind, they rested. Not in a home, but in something like it. The land had been changing for days. First, the prairie grasses grew shorter. Then the wind sharpened, not fierce, just colder at dawn. Then the horizon stopped being flat and began to rise. What had once been wide and open was now tall and narrowing. The mountains had come. Not suddenly, not like walls, but slowly, as shadows in the distance that grew, step by step, until they filled the view in every direction. For the wagon train, the sight brought silence. No one cheered. No one wept. They just looked, and kept walking. Elijah stood beside his wagon at sunrise, hands shielding his eyes, studying the ridgelines ahead. The sun broke over the peaks like liquid gold, warm in color, but distant in feeling. The air was cool, the grass wet. His breath came in faint clouds now, even in the mornings. "They're bigger than I thought," he said quietly. Mary nodded, holding the baby to her chest, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Lucy stood nearby, rubbing her hands together. "Will there be snow?" she asked. "Maybe," Elijah said. "But it's not winter." He looked back to the peaks. In the mountains, winter sometimes doesn't wait for the calendar. Climbing was slow. The trail grew narrow and rocky. Wagon wheels groaned with every turn. The oxen worked harder, pulling not just weight, but gravity itself. Men walked ahead to clear fallen branches. Women pressed shoulders to wagons when the slope grew steep. Children helped where they could, fetching water, gathering kindling, staying quiet when it mattered most. The sky above was still blue, but the shadows came earlier now, and the stars at night felt closer, as though they were being watched from above. They passed through pine forests where the air smelled of sap and wet needles. Birdsong echoed in the trees, high and thin. Squirrels darted between trunks. A deer crossed the trail once at dusk, pausing to stare at them before vanishing into the brush. The land felt alive, but it also felt ancient, and a little indifferent. Nights grew colder. The blankets, once enough, were now layered. Fires were built earlier, burned longer. Breath hung in the air even before sundown. Mary sewed a patchwork shawl for Lucy from scraps of wool. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm. Elijah rubbed the oxen with dry cloth, whispering to them in the early light, trying to coax just a little more strength from their tired bodies. One of the animals began to limp. Another refused to eat. The mountains took more than they gave. Then came the switchbacks. The path twisted sharply now, back and forth along the face of steep rises. The wagons tilted dangerously. Wheels spun in gravel. Ropes were tied to tree trunks to keep them from sliding backward. Once, a wagon nearly tipped. A barrel of lard tumbled loose and shattered on the rocks below. No one spoke as they watched it fall. The food supply grew thin. Not empty. Not yet. But carefully measured. Beans one night. Cornmeal the next. Wild herbs and roots when they could find them. Jerky cut smaller. Coffee grounds reused. Mary boiled bones into broth. Elijah scraped flour from the bottom of barrels. Each meal was a small victory. Each full belly a reason to give thanks. They passed through a narrow canyon where the wind never stopped. It howled softly, not angrily, but persistently, like breath through stone. The sound of wagon wheels echoed strangely off the walls. Ravens watched from high perches. A squirrel chattered from a ledge. Mary held Lucy's hand tight. The baby stayed quiet, pressed close to her chest. Even the oxen seemed uneasy, their eyes darting toward shadows. That night, They camped in a hollow beneath a cluster of bent pine trees. The wind still whispered, but the fire kept it at bay. They didn't sleep deeply, but they slept. One morning, Elijah found frost on the wagon seat. Just a thin layer, a delicate lace of white along the wood. But it was enough. Enough to remind them that time was running short. That autumn was near. That the first true snow might come before they reached the valleys. The children began to tire. They slept longer, complained less, not from obedience, but from fatigue. Lucy walked slowly now, asking to be carried more often. Mary's arms ached, but she never said no. Elijah's boots had holes. He patched them with strips of leather. His shoulders were sore every morning. His beard grew thicker, not from style, but from lack of time. They all grew leaner, quieter, more inward, but not weaker. Then came a day of beauty. A high plateau opened before them, a vast, golden stretch of grass at the edge of a ridgeline. The sun was low, casting long shadows. And to the west, a view. Below, far in the distance, was a valley. Green, gentle, wrapped in mist. It wasn't Oregon, but it was the next step, the next promise. Elijah stood there for a long while, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon. Mary stood beside him. Lucy held her hand. The baby dozed in the sling, soft breath against her shoulder. Almost, Elijah said. Mary didn't answer. She just nodded. The mountains were not over. But that glimpse, that green far below, gave them strength. The same way a letter from home might. The same way a warm bowl of soup might. The same way a child's hand in yours might, on a hard day. It reminded them why they walked. Why they endured. There would be more hardship ahead. Snow. Fatigue. River crossings not yet behind them. But also, there would be meadows. And game. And gentle hills once more. The trail was long. But it was not without end. As they descended the next ridge, the light behind them faded into lavender. The wind was cool. The grass crunched underfoot. The scent of pine mixed with the faint, sweet aroma of wild mint. The oxen moved forward. Slow, but steady. Always westward. Always toward that unseen place. Called home. There's a certain kind of tired that doesn't come from one long day, but from too many in a row. The kind of tired that settles into bones and doesn't leave. That turns footsteps slow. That quiets even the most talkative children. And now, in the late weeks of their journey, that tired had crept into every wagon. They had crossed rivers, climbed mountains, buried the dead, watched seasons change in the sky above them. And now, with Oregon somewhere just beyond the hills, they walked on with everything they had left. The land was changing again. The dry grass gave way to brush and scrub. The ground flattened in places, but the heat returned. It pressed down on them like a blanket made of sun and dust. The oxen walked slower now. Even the strongest animals were worn thin. One stumbled during a midday stretch, collapsing to its knees. It didn't rise for nearly an hour. Elijah sat beside it, stroking its side gently. "You've done enough, old friend," he whispered. "Just a little farther now." Supplies were nearly gone. The flour barrel was empty. The beans were dust. Even salt had run low. They chewed on hardtack too brittle to soften, soaking it in whatever water they had. Meat was nearly gone, just bits of jerky, shredded into stew. Mary kept a pot going with anything edible, foraged greens, dry biscuits, root shavings. Elijah caught a rabbit once, and the whole camp rejoiced. It wasn't a feast, but it reminded them what food could mean, not just for the body, but for the spirit. The air grew dry again. Their lips cracked. Their eyes stung. And their voices turned raspy. One afternoon, a windstorm swept over the trail. It came suddenly, a wall of dust rising behind the hills, swallowing the horizon in tan and red. The wagons were halted, blankets thrown over the canvas, children covered in shawls, eyes closed tight, mouths wrapped in cloth. The wind screamed across the open plain. It filled boots, tents, and ears. And when it passed, it left everything coated in grit. The water barrels had to be wiped clean before drinking. But through it all, they moved. Slow. Sometimes only 10 miles a day. Sometimes less. But every morning, they rose. They packed. They walked. Because forward was the only direction left. One morning, Mary awoke with a strange sound in her ears. Not the rustling of canvas. Not the wind. Not coughing or firewood cracking. It was birdsong. Real birdsong. And not the dry chirp of prairie birds, but the high, clean notes of forest birds, the kind that lived near streams and pines. She stepped outside the wagon and listened. There, in the distance, the sound of running water, and beneath that, the faint scent of pine needles and wet bark. She turned to Elijah, eyes wide. "We're close," she said. He nodded slowly, like a man waking from a long dream. That day, they saw trees. Tall ones. Not the twisted cottonwoods that dotted the plains. Not the scraggly brush of dry ridges. But full, towering Douglas firs, rising like columns into the sky. Their needles deep green. Their scent thick and sweet in the air. The light beneath them dappled and cool. The children looked up in wonder. Lucy ran her hand along one trunk, then hugged it tight. "It's so big," she whispered. Elijah ran his hand through his beard. "So are you." Mary laughed, a soft sound, not heard in days. The trail narrowed again, but the light changed. It was filtered now, soft, golden, laced with shadows. The wind smelled of river moss and fallen leaves. They passed streams. Real ones. Clear water over smooth stones. They drank deeply. Washed. Sighed. The oxen perked up. The children laughed again. And the wagons creaked forward with new energy. Still, the days remained hard. Fatigue clung to them. Shoes split. Hands blistered again. And nerves frayed. One evening, a wheel cracked. Elijah spent hours by lantern light mending it with a carved branch and nails scavenged from a crate. He worked with tired hands, his eyes nearly closing. But he finished. Because there was no other choice. Mary had a dream that night, of reaching Oregon, of green fields and quiet rain. When she awoke, she cried softly, not from sadness, but from something like relief. "We're almost there," she whispered, even though they weren't quite yet. Elijah placed a hand on hers. "We are." The final few miles felt strange. Not triumphant. Not like a race. But more like the last slow breaths at the end of a long song. Every bump in the road. Every whisper of the trees. Every creak of the wheel. Felt like a goodbye. To hardship. To the trail. To a version of themselves they might never see again. Then one morning, in the haze of early dawn, the valley appeared. They crested a ridge, tired but upright. And there, beyond the low rise, was a sweep of green. Trees. Fields. A river twisting like ribbon through the earth. In the distance, smoke. A home. A chimney. A beginning. Elijah stood still, tears in his eyes. Mary held the baby tight. Lucy stood silent, mouth open. The oxen lifted their heads, as if sensing the change. The trail had ended, but their story had not. They didn't arrive all at once. Not with trumpets. Not with celebration. Not even with tears. They arrived the way they had traveled. Slowly, step by step, wagon by wagon, carrying their hope like a lantern through the trees. The valley was wide and green. Rolling meadows opened beneath soft hills. The trees grew in graceful clumps, oak, fir, and pine, the earth rich with moss and fallen leaves. A river moved gently through the land, its banks lined with reeds, frogs singing from the shadows. It was quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet of potential, of still soil, waiting. The wagon train paused on the hill overlooking the land. No one spoke for a long time. The journey had stretched across months. 2,000 miles. Through sickness, through storms, over mountains, across rivers. Some had buried family. Some had nearly died themselves. But all who stood there had made it. The ground beneath them was no longer the trail. It was Oregon. Mary held the baby tight. The child was heavier now, stronger. She had survived dust, heat, cold, hunger. Her small face turned toward the breeze, and she smiled. Lucy stood at her mother's side, her dress patched, her hands calloused, her eyes older than her age. She didn't say a word, but her fingers reached for Mary's, and they held fast. Elijah stepped forward, removing his hat. He breathed in deep, the scent of wet grass, distant smoke, and fresh river water. It smelled like promise. It smelled like rest. They moved down into the valley the next morning. The wagons creaked gently beneath the trees. The wheels left new ruts in soft earth, not dust. The oxen, weary but steady, plodded forward through tall green stalks. There were no fences, no signs, no maps, just land, as far as the eye could see. The pioneers chose spots slowly. One family near the river, one by a grove of apple trees, another along the edge of a meadow, where deer moved in small groups, watching with calm curiosity. Elijah found a stretch of high ground, shaded by oaks. He stopped the wagon there, unhooked the oxen, looked around for a long time. Mary stepped beside him. "This is it?" she asked. He nodded. "This is home." They didn't build a house right away. That would take time, weeks of cutting, splitting, hammering. But they did set the tent. They started a fire. They dug a small trench for water runoff, gathered kindling, staked the wagon wheels. And that night, they sat beside a crackling flame, under a sky filled with stars. The same stars they'd followed from Missouri. But now, they meant something different. Now, they marked arrival. There was no going back. Not physically. Not emotionally. The people they'd been. In April, in Independence, with new boots and full sacks and soft hands, were gone. In their place were pioneers. Survivors. Builders. People who had walked through 1,000 trials, and now stood quietly beside a river, planning a future made with their own 2 hands. In the days that followed, they worked. They cleared brush, mapped rows for planting, collected stones, felled trees. Elijah split logs with calm rhythm, his muscles aching in the good kind of way. Mary boiled wild greens, made bread from the last of their flour, then used moss to scrub the inside of the pot clean. Lucy caught a frog, then released it, then sat for a long time beside the stream, her toes in the water, watching dragonflies flicker past. The baby napped in the shade of a pine tree, her breath soft and even. Other families built cabins. Smoke began to rise from chimneys. Dogs barked in the distance. Chickens clucked. Children sang while collecting berries from the edge of the woods. A community began to form. Not loud, not crowded, but steady, like the trail had been. 1 mile at a time. Now, 1 day at a time. Sometimes they spoke of the trail. Briefly, quietly. Of the river crossings. Of the night storms. Of the graves. Of the wind that whispered through the canyons. Of the moment they saw pine trees again for the first time. But mostly, they looked forward. Planting. Building. Belonging. Elijah carved a sign one evening, using the new knife he'd traded for at Fort Kearney. It simply read, "Home." He hung it from a beam on their half-finished porch. It swayed gently in the breeze. Mary touched it once with her fingertips, and smiled. The Oregon Trail had changed them. It wasn't just a road. It wasn't just hardship. It was a threshold, between the known and the unknown, between comfort and courage. It taught them what mattered: warmth, safety, kindness, persistence, and the strength to keep going, even when the way forward seemed impossible. They had reached Oregon, but more importantly, they had reached each other. The trail behind them would fade with time. The ruts would be softened by rain. The markers would wear down. The graves would grow quiet. But in this valley, and in all those who came after, the memory would remain. Of a journey worth taking. Of a cost worth paying. Of a land not claimed, but earned, one footstep at a time. And so they stayed. They planted. They built. They became the roots of something new. Not pioneers anymore. Just people. Living. In Oregon. At last.